On Wednesday, October 9, 2024, railroad historian William D. Burt gave another interesting presentation at the Nunde Historical Society on the Erie Railroad in our area. This one was on Burt Perry and the notorious Perry gang of Ossian train robbers. We join Bill as he describes how and why he became interested in this gang.
There's plenty of evidence of that too, and one of it resulted in a crime that he committed that sent him to prison for a crime that he committed in Dalton. So Burt Perry was no stranger to this area, but surprisingly, by the time I'm growing up, in the 60s and the 70s, no one remembered it except for a few people who either didn't have much to say about it, or a few like my father who did, but whose memory of it was frankly a little sketchy. Late in life, however, my father took an interest. He discovered the internet, and he discovered a website called Fulton History, where you could download old newspaper articles. And for a man who was somewhat incapacitated, not entirely, but somewhat limited in what he could do by, CP or emphysema, COPD. It was a great thing for him to get involved in that, and he did begin some research on that. And I was already interested. It was actually out of our conversations that he took an interest. So after he died, I continued with it. And as Tom and Joan remember, I stopped in here a few years ago, probably 3-4 years ago now, and asked if anybody knew anything about it. And we made, some interesting, I got some interesting insights to where I should look. And then I went to town on the research. And so you'll see tonight where this stands. It's not completely a full story, but it's pretty close at this point. I've made a lot of progress with this in unwrapping and bringing to light the life of a man who did not want to be found. And I think that's going to be a major theme out of this, was that Burt Perry, being a career criminal, did his best to frustrate everybody around him who was trying to figure out who he was, where his income came from, what he was doing, where he lived, where he was born, even down to the tiniest details. What year he was born, his birthday is somewhat of a mystery. So he was the man who did not want to be found. That's one way to start. He was born in 1877 in Pekin, New York, to his father, Commodore Perry, and his mother, Susan Morton Perry. Commodore was actually in the wake of the Battle of Lake Erie during the War of 1812. Since Commodore Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry, was the victor in that battle, and it was a great morale raiser for the United States, which was severely threatened by Great Britain in that war. Many of the next generation of Perrys in Western New York, you run across this everywhere when you're doing the research of who these people are, these Perry people. Commodore, as a first name, was given to many young boys, young babies, in that next generation. And this particular Commodore was Commodore O, which undoubtedly stood for Oliver. And so in 1877, and I put a question mark after that again because there are multiple birth dates, but this seems to be the best established one. Multiple birth dates ranging from 1873 to 1880. But the two that are most common are November 27th, 1877, or the same date in 1878. Exciting stuff for somebody who's trying to nail it down, but not all that exciting for anyone else. His mother died in 1890 of tuberculosis, and 3 of his sisters died also of TB, so the family was more or less shattered by these illnesses occurring all in a cluster. And in the late 1880s, Perry went to work, or Perry's father went to work for the New York Central Railroad as a car repairman in Niagara Falls. They moved from Pekin, which is between Lockport and Niagara Falls, out in the country. They moved from Pekin into Niagara Falls. Now, being a car repairman in those days was a hard business. And Commodore Perry had enlisted in the United States Army in 1861 when he was only 16 years old. He lied about his age and enlisted at the beginning of the Civil War and served 5 full years in the Civil War. And he had his horse shot out from under him twice and was injured in several ways, and also ill from some of the conditions that he lived in, to the extent that some of this is just complaints and hypochondriac type stuff. Who knows at this point? But he had a lifetime of hurt and trouble from his injuries and his illnesses one way or the other, and was on a military pension for that reason, but it didn't support him or his family. So he went to work in one of the toughest, most miserable jobs you could find on the railroad, which was car repair. Now, car repairmen in those days, and to some extent even now, car repairmen worked out in the weather and under the car, had to crawl under the car a lot of the time, had to work with cold iron and cold steel and wood, and it was not an easy job in any respect, and especially if you were already suffering from numerous ailments. So one possible idea that creeps in as you look at the facts of the story is that Burt began to resent how the New York Central was treating his father, who was just trying to make a living. But the father continued to work, and in 1892 he was living with Burt and his younger brother Leroy in Cheektowaga. And in 1892, Burt Perry is, 15 years old. Now, in 1895, we find Burt Perry popping up in Montana. This was the time when at least one well-known writer said the frontier is closing. But in Montana, it didn't seem that way. There were large segments of Montana that were still wide open. Part of the argument was who controlled and who had a right to that land. The Indians were still in major reservations, but the government was under great pressure to open some of that Indian land to settlement, and there was a lot of dispute over that. And at the same time, the government was quite intent on a policy of trying to make the Indian live more like the white man and get into farming, especially wheat, get into all kinds of education and religion and all of that sort of thing. So there was an ongoing effort to try to force the Indians off the reservation and out of their lifestyle. But then on the side of this, you had the individual settlers who were not always on the up and up, and I think Burt kind of fit right into that. So he moved to Montana, and not only that, but he moved to a city, a small town. City is completely wrong, to a small settlement, which even today has only 325 people living in it, Nashua, Montana, and it's on the Milk River, which flows into the Missouri River not far from this point. And Nashua is in the corner here, and the Fort Peck Indian Reservation still exists, but somewhat smaller than it was back then. And Nashua is just off the reservation in the corner, and Burt Perry moved there. Some of what the story gets into is Burt actually, though, keeping cattle on the reservation, and so it's not real clear where his property was. I'm going to have to remember to point that thing back there through your head. Don't worry about your head, I think, but you may be radioactive when we're done. In 1895, this is where Burt Perry first comes to notice. He's arrested for cattle rustling. In 1899, he marries Bessie Sargent. Now, Bessie Sargent is the daughter, the only daughter, of the founder of Nashua, whose name was Colonel Charles Sargent. And Colonel Sargent was a Confederate War veteran who had come out there thinking correctly that the Great Northern Railway was going to build a line through Nashua, its main line, and he hoped that Nashua would become the division point. So Charlie Sargent was a big man, and he had a daughter, and Burt Perry, kind of a punk even then, but somehow got on the right side of Charlie Sargent and managed to marry his daughter in 1899. They quickly had one son, born in 1901, Charlie, but in 1900, before Charlie's born, Burt is arrested for robbery. This time he and a buddy held up a coal miner at a water tank in Laurel, Montana for $20. Took $20 off the poor man. And the case was dropped because they couldn't find the victim when it went to trial, and so that was that. But he was already gaining a reputation. In 1901 and 2, in '01, he was caught altering the brands of certain cattle that it turned out were owned by his father-in-law, Charlie Sargent. This is what a creep this guy was. And I don't want to read too much tonight, but I do think this puts some flavor into it. He said, it says in this news article, 3 head of cattle were found in Perry's pasture with the brands worked over for the purpose of taking the calves. In other words, we're going to kill the cow so we can take the calf, which is not branded. Stafford, the policeman, killed 2 of the cows and found that the original brand belonged to Colonel Charles Sargent. Another cow's carcass was found with the brand cut out, undoubtedly so as to lay claim to the unbranded calf. The body had been rolled down the bank into the river. So, not some pretty stuff there. So, what happened here was he got hauled in as a result of that arrest before the federal commissioner for the reservation. Now, the feds controlled these reservations, these Indian reservations, and they were the law. I mean, there was no state involvement there at all. If you offended the federal commissioner in charge of the Indian reservation, you were in trouble. And that's what happened here. And what they basically did was they said to him, you're under arrest and you're going to go to trial and you'll be sent to prison unless you just get out of town and go. And he was warned by the Indian agent to, quote unquote, get off the red man's earth and go. And so he ignored that warning, and in late 1901 he was arrested for ignoring the warning. This time he was going to go to trial, but again in early 1902 he managed to wriggle out of that by basically promising to leave town. And even then he didn't keep his promise, because somehow he managed to get Bessie pregnant again in September of 1902. Unless they met somewhere, you know, like Glasgow, Montana or something, he was back on the reservation. She had a daughter who in 1903 was born, and the daughter was named initially for Burt Perry's aunt, but the daughter later changed her name, evidently in kind of a reaction against the whole thing. But Burt Perry was now under real warning that he had to get out of town, so he went back to Niagara Falls. And that's where his father was living now. He had not previously lived in Niagara Falls, but his father had moved there. And his father was working at the Niagara Falls yard of the New York Central, and I'll show you that in a minute. This map incorrectly says the Amtrak station is right under that arrow. Let's just ignore that, that's wrong. But it shows a current map of the city of Niagara Falls limits on the red line there. And the Perry so-called farm, which was really not a big farm, more of just a rural residence, was right at the corner of the Lockport Road and what was called Sugar Street at the time. And Sugar Street supposedly ended right here, but it was really all one street. And today is called Hyde Park Boulevard. This was called Day's Yard. David, you'll probably be familiar with some of this. It's on your railroad, I think. Mm-hmm. This was the Falls Road coming in from Rochester. If you go out this way to the west, you go to the Suspension Bridge over the Niagara River to Canada. And this was a very busy yard, and also there was another connection to a line called the Hojack that went north along the Niagara River and then turned east along the Lake Ontario shore and back toward Rochester area.
This is all post 55 when they moved the Power Authority.
Yeah, this is a current
Everything
map.
was downtown at one time.
This is a current map here. But this was an active yard even in Burt Perry's time. It was called Day's Yard, and his property, the key point I want to make here is it backed up to it.
Oh, cool.
I mean, the railroad yard was on his back door. His father worked there. That kind of made sense why his father moved to that location. It was a rented farm. And so all the father had to do was walk to work. That was a common thing. You found that in Hornell, all over Hornell. People renting a house, you know, close to the yard or the shops where they could walk to work. In 1903, Perry got a job as a New York Central fireman and also married the girl next door, literally, at the farm. Her name was Ellen Wilgus. And I have to say, every indication in the research is that Ellen Wilgus was a typical 22-year-old girl with no criminal connections, no reason for Burt Perry to know her, except that she was next door. And Burt Perry was still married to Bessie Sargent. Bessie Sargent in 1904, just to close that loop, filed for divorce in Montana on the grounds of abandonment and was quickly granted a divorce, so that was solved. But it's interesting to know that Burt married Ellen before he was divorced. 1903 on, the burglaries, car burglaries, what they called car burglaries, freight car burglaries, started. And it was particularly busy in the Niagara Falls area, and it continued at a constant drumbeat of little crimes, big crimes. Then in 1911, the Perry gang, which by this time was getting quite well organized, actually held up a moving Erie freight train, Train 178, which was the merchandise train from Niagara Falls down to Buffalo, where it connected with Train 78 and went to Jersey City for New York City traffic. Now, when I say merchandise, what I mean to say by that is if you think of anything that would be shipped by express today or by UPS or by FedEx or by anything with higher value to it, that was what typically moved on the merchandise train. And the Train 178 was selected for that reason. And what they literally did here was to shoot the air hose. This is how they did it. They'd take a revolver and shoot the air hose somewhere in the train. That would open up the air hose and set the brakes. And so they could force the train to stop wherever they wanted, so long as they were a good shot, and shoot the air hose. And in this case, I'll read just a little bit again here. It says, and as to the engineer and fireman, as the engineer and fireman started to descend from the engine to find the trouble, a man issued from the darkness and pointing a revolver, commanded them to throw up their hands. They were next told to climb back in the engine cab and stay there. And then it says a similar proceeding was taking place at the rear end. Now there's two things to think about here. This gang was well enough organized that they had automobiles at each end of the train positioned where the train would come to a stop. They were probably following the train. They knew where they wanted to stop it, and they knew what they would do when it was stopped. So they were reasonably well organized.
1911 auto wheels.
Oh yeah. And
Very fast.
they did get quite a good deal of material off the train, mostly high-value goods. I'm going to just list a couple of other major crimes in this same era. 1916, Perry was arrested for shooting a railroad detective. This is on the New York Central, and it was dropped. The case was dropped mysteriously. There is no record of this case ever resulting in a trial or a conviction.
Is he still working for the railroad?
No, not by this time. He was fired not long after the 1911 because his name hit the papers in 1911, and the New York Central had been watching him anyway. The railroad cops had been. Now, one thing to understand is it was at least said in the papers that the railroad police were in Niagara Falls in Suspension Bridge Yard, were in on, some of them were in on the crime. So there was a real give and take here, let's call it that, between the cops that wanted to put a stop to it and those that were in on the deal. But in 1911, shortly after this Erie crime, this Erie train robbery, he was fired by the New York Central. Later on, it was claimed that he continued to hold a grudge against the railroads because he was fired, but I don't think so. I think he was already thieving from the railroad long before he was fired. 1916, that was a case where he got caught by surprise by a railroad detective who was sitting on a caboose when Perry came up to stop the train, and the railroad detective surprised him, told him to throw his hands up, and Perry shot him. In 1911, I'm throwing this in here, it didn't immediately come to anybody's attention, but in 1918, Ellen was, the New York Central Railroad Police came to their home in Niagara Falls, and she was the only one there. And the police tried to get they were trying to find out where Burt was, and she didn't know, or she didn't want to say, but they ended up beating her up. And this will come up later on, but it's in the same time period. This is the reward that was put up for the 1911 train robbery. Now we come to Canaseraga and Ossian. In 1901, Perry's sister, Eva, he had a younger sister named Eva, she was still alive, married an Albert Brown of Canaseraga. Now, Albert Brown was 19 years older than Eva. She was in her 20s, and Albert was not a great success in life. He was, basically all of his life, if you look at the census records and everything else, he lived in a rented house with her. He never really seemed to get a job that provided a good income for them. But Eva was bright and friendly, and she made friends in Canaseraga. And so she was already there, and Burt Perry must have found a reason to go down and visit. But more importantly, in 1917, Commodore Perry retired. He was broken in physical condition, he was broken in health, and he had married a second time, but he and his wife picked up from Niagara Falls. I think this is pretty clear that Eva and her husband basically said to him, why don't you come down and live with us in Canaseraga instead of trying to tough it out up in Niagara Falls. And so by this time you get to 1917-18, Burt Perry's sister and his father and his stepmother are living in Canaseraga. Commodore Perry is buried in the Canaseraga Cemetery, and the headstone does commemorate his Civil War service. That was the thing he was mostly known for, and the reality is it's a little different than today. If you served in the Civil War, especially you served 5 years in the Civil War, and you could tell stories that were true stories, like having your horse shot out from under you, that the community, it didn't matter if you moved in from somewhere else, the community gave you a certain amount of respect right away for that, just for the fact of your service. And so every indication is that Commodore, despite the fact that he was in poor health and not able to do very much or contribute very much, Commodore was well treated in Canaseraga and indeed respected. His obituary said that too, and he's buried there. This is Canaseraga about 1910. This is the way it looked. You're looking from up on the hill. The road in the foreground is the road that leads south from the main intersection, crossing first of all, the Shawmut tracks and the Erie tracks here, and then the road leads out of town down toward, in the direction of Arkport roughly, down into Allegheny County. You're in Allegheny County. This is the Shawmut Depot. I'm going to show you a slightly larger version of this. This is the Shawmut Depot here, and the Erie Depot here. And so you had a nice little selection of targets for thieves. This is the Erie's Depot at Canaseraga, about 1913. In 1918 and 1919, two separate transactions, Burt Perry buys two farms on Fred Bonner Road in the town of Ossian. Now this is about 2 miles north of Canaseraga. You're across the county line, you're in Livingston County, not Allegheny County. This is one of the interesting things about Burt. He seemed to like to be on the border. It's interesting that if you're living in Ossian, you can flee to Allegheny County, and if the sheriff's deputies from Livingston County are chasing you, at least they're going to hesitate a little bit before they go into Allegheny County. Somebody will probably call the sheriff down there and make sure it's all right. And likewise, you could flee not too far away to Steuben County over around Wayland, or not too far down below the town of Burns. So he was right in that little border country there, and that was very good for him in a lot of ways. He immediately had Albert and Eva move to the lower farm. And a neighbor living right across the road, Walter knew, worked the farm on shares. In other words, a sharecropping arrangement, and basically splitting the arrangement. But if you look at it from Burt Perry's standpoint, he's still living in Niagara Falls, so Walter New, in effect, becomes the caretaker of his properties and the guy that keeps an eye on things. And Burt is thinking, yeah, I could use this. Now, one thing that I want to go back to about 1911, how did Burt Perry get arrested in 1911? He wasn't arrested at the scene of the crime, but what happened there was the police in Niagara Falls went to his home in Niagara Falls, to his barn, and found the loot in his barn. So he says to himself, I think, I'm not going to let that happen again. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But what they've got now is a separate couple of farms which are right next to each other on Fred Bonner Road in Ossian, which they can use as a hideout. Now, one other thing that made this a little inaccessible, I want to go back in time. This is a 1908 article, but it's got a single point to it, and that is Walter New, the same Walter New I just mentioned, killed a large rattlesnake, had 12 rattles and measured 5 feet in length. Mrs. New, which we'll talk more about her in a minute, Mrs. New secured 2 ounces of oil from it. So she was a tough little lady. I mean, she didn't hesitate to put the snake in the vat, squeeze the oil out of it. I gotta admire that. But Walter New and his wife Bertha, that's her name, lived on that farm and had a rattlesnake. And that whole area over there is infested with rattlesnakes, as you know, many of you. That the Rattlesnake Hill Wildlife Management Area is nearby. And you're literally within a mile or two of Rattlesnake Hill Wildlife Management Area. So it's not a very friendly place for strangers to go poking around in the woods. These are the farms. This is a 1926 map that's hanging in the town of Ossian Town Hall. This is what I'll call the lower farm. This is Fred Bonner Road running north and south. And this property here, it's a little hard to read because it's written on the side, but it says B.R. New. Now, that means Bertha Rhoda New. The property was in her name because she inherited it from her father, Edwin Scott. She was a Scott. There were other Scotts in this area. Here's George Scott, there's Edwin Scott here, that's her father. And Bertha New inherited this property, and she was married to Walter New, who then became the sharecropper, taking care of these 2 properties, raising crops here and keeping an eye on things.
What town is it up the top there?
That's Ossian Center.
Oh, okay.
And off in this direction is Dansville.
Yeah.
This upper farm, which was immediately adjacent, was the so-called Roner farm, which had been basically abandoned by the owner. The kids, his heirs, still owned it, and when he died, the kids sold it to Burt Perry in 1918. And there's a house there, I'll show this in a minute. But basically, the 2 farms are immediately adjacent, and this is interesting country in the sense that it's quite isolated, although not as much as the newspapers made it out to be. And the headwaters of Bennett Creek are up here, almost at the at the, across the road from this house. The two houses are here. This is the house that Burt and his wife used. And this was another house that they did not use, but this was actually the hideout. And so when they were not in town, when they were in Niagara Falls or somewhere else, Walter knew, who lived here, kept an eye on everything. But that's how you maintain a hideout for a gang. This is the lower farm today, the aerial view. This is where the house was, right in this area. And this is the lower farm in 1938, and you can see that it's much less wooded. That's one thing that's changed, is that a lot of land had been cleared over the years, and that's typical of the whole area, is that this was an actual farm back then, but nowadays would look more like woodland. The upper farm, where the hideout was, that house was right in here, and this is all heavily wooded today, but this is the way it looked in 1938. This was a real farm. You grew hay, you grew potatoes was one other crop they grew there. So it's a little different back then. I want to switch to talking about Hornell for a minute. One thing that I figured out just by researching and thinking about it, really based on my experience in the railroad business, is you could not have done these crimes, these train robberies, without somebody on the inside. Especially true with the high value merchandise. That moved in a special way across the railroad. It didn't just move randomly. Hornell was a great center of handling that type of freight on the Erie Railroad. This is East Avenue back in the late 30s, looking east along the main line, and there's a major yard here where all of the eastbound traffic was concerned, but most of the merchandise traffic that was handled at Hornell was the westbound, and that was where the really high value stuff came from. It came out of New England, it came out of Philadelphia, it came out of the New York area, and it all came to Hornell to be sorted and crossed and picked up in one car and moved to another car. And so Hornell was a busy place. Also had a major shop complex. This is in the 20s, looking down on the Hornell shops. Think about this. The westbound yard is up in the corner of this picture here. That's the coal towers, coal tubs, and the roundhouse. And the major shop buildings are right down in here. This is the inside of the shops in 1923. I guess the point I'm making with this is there were about 2,000 Erie Railroad employees in Hornell. It would not have been difficult to find a few who were willing to be paid to be on the inside of the crime. This was a typical engine used for the fast freight trains. This is a so-called Freight Pacific. One of the things you see here, relatively high drivers. They were not so easy to start a train with, but once you got moving, those high drivers really could move you along at a good clip. But you didn't always have the K4 Pacifics available. I've got my hands full of toys here. This is an advertisement oiling the engine of 77 at Hornell. 77 was the primary New York to Chicago merchandise train, the one that you would want to rob if you were going to rob any train in the 20s. Now this was the freight house, and this is at the corner of Loder Street and River Street, which is basically just about the entrance to Alstom at this point today. This is all changed, and this was where they brought in these long strings of merchandise cars and parked them alongside each other and transferred the freight. This is looking at it from the other direction, and you can see here that there's a shed here and a shed here and another one over here, and all these cars have steel plates. The doors have been opened and the steel plates have been dropped between the doors. They've been spotted so the doors are opposite each other, and then these big steel plates are dropped, and then these guys are going back and forth moving freight. Now what this really means from Burt Perry's standpoint is that somebody knows where all this valuable freight is. Somebody knows which car the freight is on. Somebody knows how to find it. I like this picture of the freight house. This is looking at it from the yard. This looks to me like maybe a hobo got put off and the cops told him, leave your suitcase. I don't know why else it would be there. This is what they did. See, they went from car to car with lift trucks and so forth to carry the freight shipments back and forth. But what you really wanted was you wanted somebody who would watch that car, a friend in the freight house who would watch that car and mark it with chalk so that a member of the gang could recognize the chalk mark when the car got switched into a westbound train in this yard. This is across from the station in Hornell. And this was the old westbound yard until 1953. In 1953, it was a cramped yard, so the Erie replaced it with a new yard considerably east of town. But for many years, this was how the westbound trains were made up. This is how cramped it was. These switches were so tight in here that you couldn't ride the side of a car. You'd be peeled off if they were switching cars. And so the rules actually prohibited riding the side of the car through these switches because it was too dangerous. But that was equally dangerous for the robbers. This was probably the first place where gang members could sneak into the yard and get into a car or get in the space between the cars or find an open car like a gondola where you could get on it over the top and then crouch down and try not to be seen and go right out of Hornell riding the train. That's one way they did it. You could get on out here at, this is Taylor Street, and the next street up is Cass Street, and the street beyond that is West Street. These are the streets that the Erie crosses leaving Hornell going west, and this is Cass Street Tower, and these are the switches, the leads coming out of the yards. And so the train would go through these switches at 10 miles an hour until everything was clear of the switches. Now that's another opportunity for a gang member to come out of the weeds or out of this coal operation over here or out of any place and basically hop on board the train. And they were frequently seen to be doing that. Now we get to, this is Burt Perry in 1920, off a passport application. In 1918 and 20, the car burglaries continued in Niagara Falls, but from 1920 on, some of the activity shifted to this area. And so you started to see moving trains robbed here between Canasarega and Dalton. What they did was they used automobiles to move the loot, and trucks also, to move the loot between Niagara Falls and Ossian. So that if he robbed a train on the Erie, let's say here, they would temporarily take it to the Ossian barns, to the farms, but then load it in the automobiles and their trucks and then take the road, the available roads up to the Niagara Falls area. And conversely, there were examples where they robbed trains up in the Niagara Falls area, but the loot was later found down here in Ossian. That was how he overcame what brought him down in 1911. This is the section of the area that we're talking about. Here's Hornell, Arkport, Canasarega, Dalton, Portage. I've highlighted the section. Now, probably the first big notable train robbery was the one in 1922 in April, and at westbound freight number 77 on the Erie. As I said, that was the premium merchandise train that had the valuable freight on it and was robbed of $3,000 worth of men's and boys' clothing. One of the things about Burt Perry was he wasn't looking for gold. He wasn't looking for silver bars. He was looking for the stuff that would fill a department store. And they seem to have a different plan than many of the more famous train robbers. This men's and boys' clothing was consigned to the Boston clothing store in Chicago, and the robbery occurred on the curve just east of Dalton late last Friday night. The robbers boarded the train at Hornell, broke open 3 cars, and when the train reached the curve east of Dalton, They threw out a large number of boxes containing the clothing, where a large truck was in waiting onto which the clothing was loaded. The robbers left over 300 suits of boys' clothing piled up against the fence, which were recovered by the police. Now, my great-grandfather, Leon Thompson, had some involvement in this, but not the kind you might think. His farm was right across what is present-day Route 70 from that location on the curve east of Dalton. And he had a barn on the farm, and it had a very large sawdust pile out behind the barn because he sawed a lot of wood. The Perry gang members, at least some of them, took some of those boxes of clothing and buried them in the sawdust pile. And apparently they're that desperate to hide the stuff. And Leon found it, and he didn't want to be accused by the sheriff of being a gang member, so he called up the sheriff right away and had the sheriff come get the stolen clothing. But that was a story that Tibby passed on down to me.
How do you fence all this stuff? I mean, what do you do with 300 suits in Dalton in 1922?
Well,
boy suits.
There were several articles about merchants in the Niagara Falls area who were temporarily arrested but not indicted, or
Who bought?
who basically were his fences. He had merchants in the Niagara Falls area who would sell the stuff. They never were convicted. The evidence was too skinny, but basically, yeah, he had fences. This is the hot area right in here. This is Ross's Crossing. Now, this is a 1905 map, and a lot of things have changed since this map. But in that day, the main road was present-day Chautauqua Hollow Road,
Across the tracks.
which is across the tracks from Route 70. And what the main road did, and it was all dirt road back then, was it crossed the area at a sharp angle east of where Duluth Hill Road comes down off the hill. And the main road crossed the area, then Newville Road came down out of the hills and crossed the area here and intersected Chautauqua Hollow Road right there. And then it ran up this side and then it crossed the area again here. Now all this was relocated, this highway was relocated in 1926 and 1927. So we'll get to that in a minute. But what the gang found so incredibly convenient about all this was they could drive along pacing the train right alongside on the parallel road. They could have people positioned at this crossing or this crossing, and they could also parallel the railroad right up through here. So it was a neat place to stop the train. Get your revolver out, shoot the air hose, bring the train to a stop, and then maybe have a truck parked right here at the crossing. This is the present day Ross's Crossing. As seen, you're looking east on Route 70 here, and that's the crossing today. And this is further up, this is the intersection with Chidsey Road, and this is the present day Norfolk Southern. As you can see, it's really not that far from the road. It's a little bit of a run across the field, but you could drive a truck across that field and go get your loot.
But then the road was on the other side.
No, this is further up.
Okay.
This is further up where the road is, where it was.
Which one's back on, okay.
Yeah, and there are people alive today, there's at least one who's told me that his father remembered, because his father had a trap line along this part of the railroad, remembered seeing crates, wooden crates and boxes stolen from the train lying in the ditch.
Jeez.
This was the shuttle, and the reason we know this is, I don't want to get ahead of the story, but the state police stopped Perry's car at Caledonia, actually at Batavia, on Route 5. The main road back in those days was Route 5. It was historically, it had been called the Genesee Road, one of the pioneer highways in western New York. And these are all predecessors, these roads here were all predecessors to Route 36 today. And once you got down in this area, of course, you found a back road over to Canasarega and up to Ossian. But this was how they did it. They drove back and forth. There was no direct road, and still really, when you think about it, there is not a good direct road from this area to Buffalo or to Niagara Falls. So if you were based in Ossian, the best thing you could do would be to drive due north to Canasrega. This is what they were driving for the most part. This is a Packard 8, and this is the 1924 model, which was a big advance over the previous models. Powerful car for its day. And Burt Perry was also known to have the latest model Cadillac. My father remembered stories of Burt Perry driving into Dalton in that Cadillac. And a little bit later in the presentation, we'll get to one reason why he might have been seen in Dalton, but he was not above showing up well dressed and driving a fancy car. And these cars were well known to the police. 1921, there were burglaries and blown safes at the Shawmut stations at Hornell, Canasrega, and Friendship. Erie stations at Canasrega and Dalton, other businesses at Hornell. In 1922, I'll get to this just briefly, this was a little different. They were doing some small-time train thieving down in Wellsville. And one of their members got caught by the local police and was shot. And he went into the Wellsville Jones Memorial Hospital, and the gang broke him out of there 2 days later. The gang went in, held up the front desk of the hospital, held up everybody in sight at gunpoint, and got this guy out of the hospital. So that made quite an impression in Wellsville. There were 3 railroad detectives. These 3 gentlemen, one from the Erie, the Lackawanna, and the New York Central, who were hot on the trail of the Perry gang during these years in the early 20s. Later in life, when they were retiring especially, they all were very proud to claim their role in putting Perry away. It gets to the point where you don't know who exactly was it that arrested him in Niagara Falls that day in 1924, but apparently they all had a hand in it. And I suppose to some extent they did. I want to focus particularly to try to get this into sharp focus on a part of 24 that led to a conclusion. On June 25th, they robbed an Erie train at Ross's Crossing, pretty much the way we just talked about. July 9th, robbed another train at the crossing. Now this time, see, it turned out differently, because the Erie, after the first train was robbed, decided to put the railroad police on the train and ride the train every day until it happened again. And so on July 9th, the train was robbed again at Ross's Crossing, and there was a black member in the crew who had recently joined the crew. Harrington was supposedly his name, but he later changed his story and his name became something else. But he gave a name of Harrington at first. And as the detective, I won't read the whole thing here, but basically the detective, when the train was brought to a stop at Ross's Crossing, the detective came down from the caboose and started walking along the train. And then at one point he heard voices on the other side of the train, so he climbed through the train and found himself right in the middle of the gang unloading. They had a truck backed up to the train at Ross's Crossing, and he found himself right in the middle of the whole operation of unloading the loot from the car onto the truck. And they got out their guns and they started shooting at him, and he returned fire, and this fellow Harrington, the black member of the gang, got shot in the gut. And what it ended up being the case, they thought Harrington was going to die, but they put him on the train, on the caboose, and took him to Warsaw Hospital. The train was actually the fastest way to the nearest hospital, strange as it may seem. So the train took him to Warsaw Hospital. He spent the next 2 or 3 days in Warsaw and actually apparently recovered. So that one didn't turn out so well, but no one was arrested as a result of that except Harrington. July 16th, oh, by the way, Harrington had been seen climbing on, and other gang members had been seen climbing on the train in Hornell. That developed too. July 16th, they held up a New York Central train at Niagara Falls. And on July 23, they robbed another New York Central train on the so-called Hojack line at Wilson, New York. And that was the line across I guess I told this story already. This is about Harrington here. so we won't pause on it. This is Wilson. Oh, I didn't want to do that. This is where Wilson is. Here's Rochester here, Suspension Bridge, Niagara Falls, Buffalo's down here. Wilson is several stations east on the Hojack. You're out near the lake, and you've basically been climbing, let's see, up the escarpment, I think,
Yes.
to get to Wilson. So it's in grade territory, so the train isn't moving all that fast, and so they robbed the train at Wilson. July 24th, burglarized a car at Niagara Falls. July 26th, held up 3 Lackawanna trains at Atlanta, between Atlanta and Wayland. If you know the location, there's a road crossing over there called, in the present day, Sawdust Road. And I think it's Sawdust Road because there's only 2 crossings. I'm sorry, I don't want to do that. That's actually good, right there. I guess I don't have to read from these anymore. That's right, I got this up on the screen. This was what happened. They had figured out, because Perry was a former railroad man and his gang members included railroad men too, they had figured out that all you had to do was shunt the circuit between the 2 rails to set the signals to stop ahead of a train. And so what they did was they positioned 3 trucks and several automobiles, including Perry's Packard, out at the Atlanta crossing, the crossing between Atlanta and Wayland. And in fact, later on, one of the witnesses came forward and said, yeah, he drove by there and saw 4 men sleeping in a car a few hours before the train robbery, and didn't think to say a thing about it, but there they were, sleeping in a car next to the crossing. So Perry, then the gang set the signals to stop. What happens that the first train they got, and it might have been the one they wanted, was the Mail and Express train westbound, and that would have had some valuable stuff on it, but the problem was it also had a lot of passengers on it. And so the gang quickly realized, yeah, we're outnumbered here. So they decided to, after holding up the crew, they decided to just wave them on through. And so the first train was allowed to go. Of course, no sooner did he get to Wayland, you can darn well bet, but they stopped and went into the station and had a telegraph report made of being held up. So right away, the police were on the way. The next 2 trains were freight trains. These 2 they stopped, each one in turn, using the same thing with the signals, and basically looted the cars. They got they had 3 trucks ready on the scene, and 7 cars were looted in all. It was actually a major train robbery, and the loot went to the Ossian hideout. Now that's important. It will be important in a few days. And that was obviously only temporary. They're going to move it up to Niagara Falls. Now, what happened in the second Wilson? Did I skip something here? I want to make sure.
No.
Okay, yeah. This is what I did skip over. I stopped at the Lackawanna and didn't mention the one. On August 1, a gang member was killed at Wilson. Now that's the end of the story, but the beginning of that story was they tried to repeat what they had done previously, robbing a train at Wilson, New York, and that was not smart, because this time the New York Central had done something fairly intelligent. They had taken a railroad detective and sealed him inside one of the targeted cars in Suspension Bridge Yard, and then put the car in the train and let it be known that the car would be in the train. And the Perry gang took the bait. They followed the train out to Wilson, and what they did here, and I haven't explained this so far, but this was common to the 1922 train robbery at Dalton. It was common to several other train robberies. What they did, one of the gang members would carry a rope ladder. And they weren't just riding the train. They would be able to climb to the roof. They would attach the rope ladder to the running board on top of these wooden freight cars. There was a space under the running board, and you could tie something onto it. And then they'd throw the rope ladder over the side and they'd climb down. You needed a small guy to do this. And they had a guy named Frank Gardner in the gang whose nickname was Canadian Shorty. And he was only like 5'6" or something like that. Canadian Shorty. And so that day in Wilson, what happened was Canadian Shorty threw the rope ladder over the side and broke the seal on the car and opened the car, and the train's rocking along at 10-15 mile an hour like always, and the cop in the car says, "Hands up, I've got you dead to rights." And he had a shotgun in his hand, and instead Canadian Shorty started firing. At least that's what he says. And so the railroad detective emptied that shotgun at Canadian Shorty, and Canadian Shorty was dead. So Burt Perry was found in an automobile pacing the train on the parallel road. This whole thing had been pretty well arranged. They knew where to look for the other gang members. There were 2 gang members at the Wilson station waiting to see what happened with the train. Perry was found in his automobile. He wasn't immediately arrested, but they came back for him in another few days and arrested him finally.
Where's the Atlanta penitentiary? Atlanta, New York?
Atlanta, Georgia.
Why Atlanta, Georgia?
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Robbing a freight train actually is a federal crime. And it was then. There was a law passed in 1913 called the Carlin Act, and it made it a pretty big crime to rob a freight train because freight trains were moving in interstate commerce, and they were regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission, so on and so on and so on and so forth. So anyway, so this crime landed in the lap of a very active and prominent federal attorney for the U.S. District of Western New York, the United States Attorney for the Western District of New York, by the name of William J. Donovan. And William J. Donovan, at this point in his career, was in high drive. He had been talked about as a potential Republican candidate for governor of New York. He was very popular politically for his prohibition activities. He was not necessarily anti-alcohol, but he was a very strong believer that if the law has been passed, my job is to enforce the law, and the law ought to be respected. That was kind of everything, the beginning and the end of William J. Donovan. So he was very well thought of. And the other thing that was happening in 1924 that bears on this is that President Garfield's, not Garfield,
McKinley?
No. Who's the president? I'm having a mental block. President before Coolidge, the one from Ohio. Harding, yes, Harding. Why? I got stuck on Garfield. Harding had a, some of you may recall hearing the phrase the Teapot Dome scandal, which was really centered in the Department of Justice. Harry Doherty, the Attorney General, was in the middle of that. So Harding was gone. Coolidge was in the middle of reorganizing the Justice Department, and in another few months, this would result in a big move for Donovan. But for the time being, at the point when this crime was committed, Perry came before Donovan, and he was still the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of New York. But a man going places. Now, Donovan wanted evidence, and you can see from the court papers and the indictment papers that he was really big on evidence. So he sent the railroad detectives the night that Perry was arrested, sent the railroad detectives, allowed them to use Perry's car, the same one that had been shot up by the railroad detectives in Wayland, when the railroad detectives arrived at the scene of the third train robbery. And Perry fled, and the people fled at Wayland, his gang members. There were bullet holes in the back of Perry's car as a result of that. And so now Perry's arrested in Buffalo in the U.S. Attorney's office. And the U.S. Attorney Donovan has allowed 3 railroad detectives to commandeer Perry's car, and they take a reporter for the Buffalo Express with them to go down to the Ossian farms and go through the stuff they find in the barns. you know, the loot that they find in the barns, and see if they can trace any of it to either the Wilson robbery or the Wayland robbery, the Wayland, Atlanta robbery. So there's a rather interesting article in the Buffalo Express the next day or so, where the reporter describes how this happened. The reporter describes the nighttime drive across Route 5. They get stopped in Batavia by the state police because the state police recognized the car, big Packard with the bullet holes in the back of it. And the state trooper who stops them immediately sees that they're all railroad detectives and a clumsy reporter sitting in the back seat. And basically puts his foot up on the running board and gets out his little pad, and he's told that Canadian Shorty's been killed. So he goes through his pad and he crosses off Canadian Shorty's name on the pad. So this is how closely they were being watched. Then they get to Caledonia, they turn south on what is now Route 36. They get down to Canasarega sometime early in the morning. And I can just imagine this because you really get the sense of this in the article, and it's not hard to fill in the details. Here's these three guys from Buffalo. They've been on the road all night. They got a reporter who probably talks too much, and they sail into Canasarega, and they start asking questions about where Burt Perry is, you know, where his home is. So whoever they talk to sent them.
They're in his car?
They're in his car,
Okay.
but I don't think the people they're talking to necessarily know that. So instead of sending them the logical route up this road to that place, to that farmhouse and that farmhouse there, which would be the hideout, whoever they talked to decided to really send them on the interesting route. So we go out and I'm going by the article now. This is apparently the route that they took. They went along present day Route 70 until, only the local people are going to know this, but this is the bottom of Little England Road.
It's a real rough road.
Real rough road. Little England Road goes right up the hill like that. Little England Road is the one that leads into the Rattlesnake Hill area. But even many of you here probably don't know this, that I didn't, and it took me a while to go out there and check it out. There was another old road. You still see some evidence of it there locally if you stand there and look at it at the base of the hill, that went up the hill like this, turned, went up the hill. It was pretty treacherous. It was worse than Little England Road. And it tied in, it went here, and then it tied into the west end of Graham Road. Now, in the present time, all this is state land, and Graham Road kind of dead ends out here. I think you probably can go right on into the state land from Graham Road, but I'm not sure where it ends. So back in the day, in the 20s, all this was public highway. So whoever their nice little friend was in Canasarega sent them on the interesting route. And the reporter made a big deal about how remote and how difficult it was to find Burt Perry's house. It's really not that tough, but it was about 2 miles out of Canasarega. Now what they found when they got there, I'll finish this part of the story. What they found when they got there was over $200,000 worth, which was big money back in 1924, of everything that a department store could want. I mean, it was clothing, it was silk. Silk was particularly valuable. It was cooking goods, it was silverware, all that kind of stuff. China. So it was quite a haul, and the barns were full to overflowing. And the Lackawanna detective did, in fact, trace some of it to the Wayland, Atlanta train robberies. The accomplices that were brought in with Perry include some of these other individuals. Thomas Shanahan has already served, in 1924, had already served 2 terms in Auburn prison for car burglary and assault. And also Edward Kelly, Perry, and William Carpenter. I really put this up there just so you can see their names up on the screen, because I'm going to show you who they were. This is just part of the prison paperwork for Thomas Shanahan. Shanahan was a violent guy, not too bright apparently. Was more in prison than he was out of prison in his later life. But he was one of the major hitters in the gang. David J. Goodwin was present at the Wayland, Atlanta train robberies. He was not present at Wilson, New York. And he was...
What's his shop record in the corner? Disciplined, just Camp Ira, who...
I think that's just a record of what work they did at the prison.
Oh.
Don't ask me to be an expert on prison paperwork. Carpenter was an interesting guy. Carpenter was a little more sympathetic to the public, and the newspapers treated him a little better, but he was no less of a criminal. He was commonly considered by the railroad police to be Perry's top lieutenant. That's the phrase they used. Actually seemed to be a little more intelligent than most of the gang members. This is the prison. In the end, Perry was sentenced to 2 years in Atlanta, federal prison. Shanahan was sentenced to 2 years, and a third gang member, Edward Kelly, who was actually a full-time fireman for the city of Niagara Falls, was sentenced to 1 year. It was judged that he wasn't quite as guilty, but they all did receive sentences. So the 1924 crime wave got a little quieter, at least in this area, for a while. Now, Ellen finally decided to do something about getting beaten up by the railroad cops in 1918. And this one, I won't dwell on it endlessly, but she ended up suing the United States government because in 1918, the railroads were under the control of the federal government. The railroad cops were actually working for the New York Central Railroad, but the New York Central Railroad was under federal control like every other railroad during World War I. And they didn't come out of from under federal control until March of 1920. So her lawyers evidently told her, you'll have to sue the federal government because the central is just, you know, in between, and it's actually the federal government that will defend the lawsuit. Well, she did, and what she basically claimed in the lawsuit, and I have no reason to disbelieve her, frankly don't understand, I see no reason why Ellen Perry would have gotten into court with the federal government, of all things, and tried to initiate litigation unless she really had some wrong done to her and she thought she could win the case. And basically, she claimed she was beaten up so badly that she suffered from injuries on a continuing basis, and she wanted, I think it was $25,000 in compensation for her injuries. And at one point in the lawsuit, the government attorney says this is basically a lawsuit against the New York Central. Well, that's true, but the government was on the hook. Well, the government did everything to delay it and stall, but, and finally her lawyers quit. Now, see, the problem was Burt's in prison, so there's not a lot of money available to Ellen to pay lawyers. And I think she probably was abandoned by her lawyers because she couldn't pay them. In 1925, she finally moved from, Burt's still in prison, she moved from Niagara Falls, which after all was just a rented farm, and moved to the lower farm at Ossian. And she also hired new lawyers in Hornell to pursue this lawsuit. In early 1926, she actually won on appeal, but the judge said, if you don't pursue this lawsuit within so many months, I'll go ahead and dismiss it. And she apparently still was short of money because she did not pursue it any further, but she continued to claim that she suffered from injuries. This was the part of the appeal documents. In 1926, the bombs laws were passed in New York. Some of you will remember the 3 strikes and you're out law in New York State that was passed, what was it, the 70s or the 80s? And it was controversial at the time, and many were for it, and many began to see problems with it. This all was not the first time. The bombs law actually were the first time. What the bombs law said was a 4th felony and you're out. You're basically punishable. You'll go to prison for life without a hope of parole. And what happened in the following years was that judges and juries resisted those laws. There were 2 or 3 separate statutes that's why we call it the Baum's laws. But the judges and the juries, there were too many cases where the juries found that the 4th felony was over something really minor, like stealing a loaf of bread or something. And so the juries basically refused to convict and would often deadlock the case. That's how the juries resisted it. There was even an allegation, made in the legal press that this was a kind of a jury nullification movement getting underway. The judges were also equally, in many cases, resistant to this idea. The other thing that happened was the Baum's laws filled the prisons in New York immediately to overcrowding. And the prisons of New York were not ready for it. The prisons of New York, the principal prisons were the Clinton prison at Dannemora, the Auburn prison, and Attica. Those were the big 3 at the time. And they were, especially Dannemora and to a lesser extent Auburn, they were antiquated. There was no proper sewage facilities, there were no proper sanitation. To say it was crowded was beyond, beyond exaggeration. So essentially there was almost immediately a crisis. The other thing, however, that happened during the time that Burt Perry was in prison in Atlanta was the situation changed here locally. The railroads began to step it up speed-wise, and that was an important change. The Erie Railroad introduced more powerful engines in 1925 and 27, and in 1927 and 28, the Canasarega-Dalton Highway, the paved highway, the first paved highway, was built. This is the one that you've got to be fairly old in years, although I am old enough to remember when the new highway on the north side of the railroad at Ross's Crossing was still open concrete. You could drive down it and you heard concrete slabs. And those concrete highways were built as a part of the state's 1926 highway building program. And the Dalton-Canasarega Highway was part of it. And the thing to note here is for 2 years, the road was unavailable to the gang. You couldn't drive that way because the road was closed. There was no road. The newspapers carried weekly reports about which roads were open, which roads were closed, and how far around the horn you had to go to simply drive between Canasarega and Dalton. So if you were thinking of driving your trucks along paralleling the railroad to rob the Erie train, you weren't going to do it for 2 years. And then, of course, the concrete highway was something totally different. The engines, this is what was common on the Erie in 1924. These were a fairly lousy type of steam engine, but they were good for dragging trains at 10, 15, 20 miles an hour. They weren't so good at moving them any faster than that. They were the so-called Russians. This was the result of an order by the Russian Tsar prior to 1917 for 500 engines from the Baldwin Locomotive Works. And of course, the revolution in Russia happened in 1917, and Baldwin was caught with about couple hundred of these engines had been built, and the U.S. government seized them because there was a need for steam engines at that point. And the U.S. government paid Baldwin for the engines and then parceled them out to whichever railroad was ordered to take them. Erie took 50 of them, I think, and they lasted and continued to be the main freight engine into about 1925, but they were slow. And what that meant was that if you were hanging from a rope ladder on the side of a car, you were only dealing with probably 15, 20 mile an hour. The situation changed when the train got a lot faster. This is another picture of one of the Russians after it's been turned more to look like an Erie engine, modified. The next generation was introduced in 1925, at least on this division, the so-called Mikado type engine, or Mikes. A little bit bigger engine, heavier, more powerful, faster. This is at Arkport and at River Junction. The mics were all that were used between Hornell and Buffalo because of Portage Bridge. You couldn't take a heavier engine on that line until 1944. Then in 1927, the Erie really stepped it up. In 1927, the Erie introduced on the Allegheny Division, which also ran through Dalton and Canaseraga on the same track. Those engines ran between Hornell and Salamanca, New York, and they were big and they were powerful and they were fast. They were the so-called Berkshires, and the engine drivers, as you can see, are somewhat higher than that other type of engine we were showing you a minute ago, and they were much faster. As this picture shows, this picture was taken at Burns, coming west of Burns on the Erie. These trains could move along at 50 or more, even with a freight train. So it wasn't so much fun to hang off the side of a car on a rope ladder anymore. That changed all in just a few years. Perry was released from federal prison in 1927. The gang resumed activity robbing trains at Niagara Falls, and he leased the upper farm at Ossian, since he didn't have an immediate need for it, to what I'll describe as men from New York City, but the local papers described as Italians from New York City. I'm not going to say anything about Italians as such, but you know what they meant at the time. Yeah. This was in the middle of Prohibition, and in 1928, about a year later, there was a raid in the middle of the winter on the upper farm, and the feds found a still there that was as big as anything they'd ever seen. Let's see, I don't necessarily want to leave that quickly. There were also railroad stations at Birdsall and at Dalton. And when the police found Perry and one of his gang members at the upper farm, the hideout, at Ossian, they were questioning the other gang member, and Perry somehow got back into the kitchen and slipped out of the house. And he fled. He fled to the upper Midwest for the winter, which is not the most pleasant place to go, but reportedly later said that he lived in North Dakota. He apparently had friends out there still. Lived in North Dakota and Montana and Colorado. So he moved around, but it wasn't until spring that he was back in the area. This is the article about this distillery, and let's see here. I just want to show you this part. According to agents, the plant was of the very latest design, a type that is now used by the government itself. I don't know why, but the equipment is estimated to be worth more than $50,000. Wow. So it was a big still, 2 stories high. It says here that one of the two so-called Italians, I guess they were, one of the two men was upstairs and tried to jump out of the 2nd-story window and didn't succeed at it. So they were both captured. And they were both released on bail and never appeared again. This is the Birdsall Station. This was at the same time broken into by the Perry gang, and they also broke into Dalton. This is on the Shawmut. This is the Dalton Station. In 1929, Perry did slip back finally in March, and it was still winter, and 2 deputies from the Allegheny County Sheriff's Office and 2 state troopers hid out in the barn one morning, slipped up there during the early morning hours, waded through the snow, had to park their car down the road. They couldn't go any further in the snow. Hid in the barn, and Perry comes stumbling out there about 9 o'clock, kind of must have been a little groggy or something, but comes out there to the barn to feed the cows, and he's surprised by the troopers and the 2 sheriffs. One of them, Ed Atherton, was a world champion wrestler, so you didn't want to mess with Ed Atherton. And they caught Burt Perry, and he was caught good and hard. So he was arrested and convicted for that, and sentenced to 5 years at Auburn State Prison. Perry was also arrested a few days later by the Erie Railroad detectives, and I get the sort of sense of the way this came down, that the Erie didn't want to be left out of this. They had their Dalton station had been broken into. They wanted to get their claws into Perry too. So they arrested him. He was out on bail for the Allegheny County indictment, the Birdsall station. And the Erie Railroad detectives came down from Buffalo and hauled him into court in Geneseo. So he's in prison one day in Geneseo, and the Allegheny County Sheriff's deputies show up in Geneseo and basically say, we're taking him. And I think it had been prearranged, but it wasn't open for discussion. So they took him down to Belmont, and they promptly convicted him, and he went off to Auburn. The Dalton Station burglary was, so far as I can tell, just dropped. And it might have been because he was already in prison, but as you'll see later, that didn't stop Livingston County later on. So it may have just been somebody decided, hey, here's other things to do. Which is strange because it could have been felony number 3 for Burt Perry. The Baum's laws were still in effect. This is the article about the 2 separate indictments. This is how he looked as he was entering Auburn. Now Auburn, in early 1929, he went in May. Auburn was suffering from extreme overcrowding as a result of the Baum's laws. And in July, the inmates of Auburn, many of them rioted and actually succeeded in burning 2 of the buildings in this prison compound at Auburn State Prison. So far as I know, Perry was not part of it, but he certainly did thrive in a situation like that where there were angles galore. So he spent another couple of years in Auburn. There was another riot in Auburn in December, which was a smaller riot, and there were also riots in Clinton Prison at Dannemora. These led Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt to propose legislation to modify the Baum's laws, and that was the beginning of a legislative effort that took several years to basically step back from what the Baum's laws had tried to do. But it began with the riots at Auburn. Now, in 1929, you would think it'd be all quiet, but it was anything but quiet in Ossian. In 1929, in September, Burt's been in prison for, ever since May. Ellen is out picking apples at the upper farm with Bertha New, her good friend across the road, and the wife of Walter. And they're up there, they walked a half mile or so up the road to the upper farm, and they're picking apples. It's a nice day in September, early September 5th or so. And this is not September 5th, this is at the end of September. And they come close, they go in close to the house, and they smell this awful smell coming out of the cistern behind the house. So they ask a farmhand who was also working for Burt Perry in some fashion, but we're not sure how, ask the farmhand to open up the cistern, and they find a dead body of an Italian man, well-dressed, apparently from New York City, who had been in the area making a number of calls, one in Dansville, one in Olean. They didn't know who it was. They weren't sure he was from New York City, but there was indications that it was. Well-dressed. And he had a bullet hole in the back of his head. And he'd been floating in that cistern for about 3.5 weeks. Ellen told the police that she heard back around the 4th or 5th of September that she had been outside the house on the lower farm one day, and she saw a car drive by going north on Bonner Road, and she then heard 6 shots, and then heard the car speed away in the direction of Dansville. She did not explain, there's nothing in any of these articles, it's how frustrating it can be sometimes to try to figure out these things. No explanation anywhere in these articles about why she didn't report this to the police right away, and why she wasn't curious enough to go check on what was going on at the upper farm, which she owned. And so there the body lay in the cistern, I guess, for 3.5 weeks. The other thing that happened that same day, there was a brush fire started near the farm, and some of the local farmers had to, form up a group and go put out the fire. No one seemed to have any questions about that either. But in the brush fire was found that the brush fire started with an overcoat, actually a jacket, a suit jacket, that had been, somebody had set fire to it, and then that started the brush fire. So nobody was really showing any curiosity about this. So then along comes this floating body situation. This time the sheriff was called in, and this massive murder mystery thing got started, and I won't dwell on it too long, but they found the body on the abandoned farm. They suspect murder. Well, really, yeah. Said the dead man was garbed in light check trousers and a striped shirt. Possible clues were a card found in the man's clothing and bearing the name of the Hotel Windsor at Ossian, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, there's a lot of that kind of thing, but really they didn't know. And there was a whole lot of activity from police in Niagara Falls and Buffalo and Dansville, Livingston County. But 2 years later, it still hadn't been solved. And by the passage of 2 years, at least there was a decent theory. And the theory I've highlighted in yellow basically comes down to this, that when the still was seized and the 2 men were arrested, the 2 men that were found with Perry, found at the still in 1928. The owner of the still in New York City was a bootlegger in New York, and he refused to bail out the 2 men. And the theory that the local sheriff came up with, and he actually traveled to New York to find out that the bootlegger was now missing down in New York. He had not been seen in several months. The theory was that the friends of the 2 men who had, been the victims, who had not been bailed out, those 2 guys got their revenge by hiring somebody to lure the bootlegger up to the still and kill him there. And that appears to be the best theory, but it never was solved. The Ossian Farms in 1931, the lower farm was sold at foreclosure. Now, I think this probably was a tax issue, but it may have been also a bank loan issue, because the Canaseraga State Bank actually was the winning bidder in the auction for the foreclosure. The property was later sold by the bank to Roland Scott, who was a distant relative, not so distant actually, of Bertha Scott New, Walter New's wife. Ellen Perry continued to live on the lower farm until she died. In 1936, Livingston County simply took the upper farm for taxes. And you can see the effect here of having Burt Perry sitting in jail and not earning anything. In order to figure out, I don't want to talk about Roland Scott without having some proof that he was related, so I did a little bit of work on this, and this is Roland's great-grandparents, James Scott and Jeanette Schoon. There's an awful lot of Scottish names over there, Holdred, Scott, Graham, there's quite a few, Fawcett. So here's Roland. And so I go back here to Roland's great-grandparents, and then the next slide. This is Bertha's great-grandparents, same James Scott, Jeanette Schoon, but through a different line down to the present. Bertha Rhoda Scott, married to Walter Adam New. So yeah, they were related. And it turns out, when I later obtained some of the prison records for the last prison that Burt was in, or excuse me, the second to the last prison, It turns out that Roland was actually treated by Burt almost as an executor. He was trusted by Burt. There were two people that Burt trusted toward the end, and one was Roland, and the other was a woman up in Niagara Falls who was a friend of Ellen's. Just to show a little bit, and this is potentially interesting to anyone with relatives here, but this again is Walter Adam New, Bertha Rhoda Scott, and then you go down into the next generation. There are connections to Ringelbergs, Gary.
Thanks.
There are three separate connections.
We knew it all along.
Between the News and the Ringelbergs. There are two of them on the screen here, and then there's my grandmother's great good friend, and your mother, right?
Margaret.
Yep. No, Margaret was your mother. That's right.
Margaret.
And it's her sister I'm thinking of.
Well, Margaret and Althea were both
Althea.
Ringelbergs.
Althea is the one I'm thinking of. Well,
Yeah.
Althea was married to, obviously, a maker, and Anna New was the original Archie maker's wife.
Yeah.
That's the third connection.
Yeah.
Now, those connections mean, as far as I can tell, absolutely nothing, except that, yeah, it's a small world. But this pairing here meant something. Walter New was a sharecropper and an ally of Burt right from the beginning. There are people alive who remember being told by Walter New Jr. that Bertha actually, quote unquote, drove for Burt Perry. Now, that doesn't mean that she was serving as Burt Perry's chauffeur, because Burt Perry could drive, and he drove all his adult life. She drove as part of the gang. At least that's what's been said. Now, this is the same Bertha Scott New who didn't hesitate to boil down a rattlesnake and produce 2 ounces of oil, so I think she was a rather interesting person. I also wanted to mention, just show this map again, this is where Bertha and Walter lived on this land here, and then these are the two farms. So this is where the cistern murder was, on the upper farm. Okay, well, the rest of the story is less eventful, but it's interesting nonetheless. If you're interested in how the life ends of a major train robber. He was arrested, as I said, in 1935. This is the Allegheny County mugshot. This is Burt Perry in his farmer's hat. He's been caught out in the barn, and I guess they didn't let him change clothes, so that's the way he was photographed. The Dalton, let's see, did I want to come here yet? Okay, I wanted to mention this. In 1935, he was arrested for passing a bad check in Canasarega. He was given 5 years at Attica. That was the Allegheny County arrest by the Allegheny County, the second. This isn't for the Birdsville Station, this is for a bad check. 1935. Timmy was old enough, or young enough to, and old enough actually at the time to remember this. And then he was arrested almost at the same time for a bad check in Dalton, and he was indicted but not tried. That gets interesting later on. This is the arrest document for the bad check in Canasarega, the mugshot. This is how Dalton looked in the late 30s. This was the state road, one of these new concrete roads. My dad always objected to having it called the old state road. In his mind, there was one state road, and it was the state road. So, just going to say that for his sake. Looking down the track to the west, and then a close-up of the, oh, I didn't want to do that. A close-up of the red and white store. This is the red and white store, the grocery store, where Burt Perry passed the bad check in 1935. It was owned by Kent Van Ostrom at the time. He was later that year about to sell it, and did sell it. And Kent and Ossian, strangely, well, not so strangely if you know the family, and I don't, but I know that he had two relatives that were prison guards. Kent and Ossian took a job at Woodburn State Prison as a prison guard, which ended up being where Burt Perry went. That must have had some interesting conversations, but anyway, that was a bad check for $18 or something like that. This was the mugshot going into Attica in 1935. He wasn't there very long. He was transferred in January 1936 to Woodburn. And Woodburn was a funny place. Woodburn was almost a brand new prison. This was largely a result of the constant controversy over the antiquated state prisons. Well, what they did was they built a new prison down in Sullivan County in the Catskills that was intended, it actually wasn't called a prison, it was intended to be what they called a institution for defective delinquents. And it sounds funny now, but it was serious business back then. The progressive movement, one of my major interests, the progressive movement had the idea that people could be classified according to certain physical characteristics and test characteristics and how they tested on various exams and that sort of thing. And one of the things that they were interested in the prison area, which was actually, you can see the reason why they thought this, they thought that the inmates who were merely not as, a substandard intelligence, let's call it that, should be separated out from the other inmates so that the other inmates wouldn't prey upon them. And then there was a category that they called borderline that was in the middle. I don't vouch for any of this, I just say that's the way they did it. And supposedly Woodburn was only going to be filled with so-called defective delinquents. These were people who had committed crimes but had been judged to be not bright enough maybe to understand fully what they'd done or be correctable. And what immediately happened was the overcrowding in the other state prisons got right up in the way of all that, because within a matter of months after Woodburn opened in 1935, Attica started sending certain selected inmates down to Woodburn, and so did certain the other prisons, Clinton and so forth, Auburn. And typically what they would do is they would pick something close to a trustee, but it also had to be somebody who qualified on the test as borderline. And so I think what they meant was borderline stupid or something like that. But essentially what they did was they pulled out the ones they thought they could send to Woodburn safely. And so Burt Perry was actually inmate number 98 at Woodburn. He was one of the first 100 inmates to be admitted to Woodburn. And he had a fairly easy ride there. The correspondence is voluminous, and it shows actually, if it's telling the truth, it shows that the administration of that prison was actually fairly humane toward Burt Perry, and thought and praised him to the skies when he came up for parole. So he had a fairly smooth ride there, but he still wanted to be free. In 1936, Ellen died. He was brought up with a deputy, released for a day, to either, he could take his pick. The state policy allowed one but not two trips. You could come see her before she died, or you could come to her funeral. And you couldn't do both. And he chose to come after she died. She begged him in several letters to come before, and she had her nurse write to the prison superintendent. She had her doctor write. They all begged to have him come before she died, and he didn't. And I still don't know why. He did sort of offer an explanation, and it had to do with the property. He wanted to take care of the property. This is how it ended up. In November 1938, he came up for parole. Livingston County discovered that he was coming up for parole and finally decided to prosecute the bad check charge at Dalton. And so there's a little bit of correspondence here. I won't dwell on it too long, but basically I think this is an important one. This is from the district attorney in Livingston County in Geneseo. It says, at the time of the issuance of the bench warrant in 1935, I delivered it to the sheriff with instructions that it was to follow Perry, but evidently through some error, this was not done. So the implication of this, I think, is that Livingston County simply forgot. Now, you realize, prior to 1936, the bonds laws were still in effect. So if this indictment had been prosecuted through to a conviction, gone to trial and everything in 1935, Perry would have gone away supposedly for life until the bonds laws were repealed. But apparently there was an oversight. Then there's another letter a few weeks later. It says, we've filed a new bench warrant and we're coming to your institution at Woodburn. We're going to send 2 deputies down there to grab Perry the minute he's released on parole. And that's exactly what happened. And it says, will you kindly deliver it to deputies Wilson and Artlett? This is from the files of the prison superintendent, and he's filled in their first names, initials there, to your number 98. They use Albert Perry. That's a mistake. That's government officials everywhere seem to say, you know, Albert, because they assumed it was Burt Perry was a nickname of Albert, but it wasn't. Anyway, so Wilson and Artlett bring him back. They didn't bother to dress him up for a mugshot. This was how he looked that day when he got back to Geneseo. They promptly put him on trial, like on the 2 days later. And he was convicted the same day. And he was convicted for 10 years at Attica, sent to Attica for 10 years. No going to Woodburn this time. Now, here's the last laugh. I almost put a slide in here that just simply said the last laugh. The county also discovered that the state was interested in acquiring the upper farm at Ossian to add to the Rattlesnake Hill, what's now the Rattlesnake Hill Wildlife Management Area. And the county had taken the property on a tax deed, but the state wanted a quitclaim deed, which was a little more effective legally. And having been in the railroad business, I know that the state was always fussy whenever they took property from the railroad. They do it all the time. They take property for drainage, they take property for crossings, for highway widening, for ditches, you name it. And the state is fussy about stuff like that. John, I guess you must know about this.
Yes.
And they, one of the things that they always insist on is having a proper deed. They don't want any restrictions on the kind of a deed that it is. And a tax deed apparently wasn't enough. So the treasurer for the Livingston County, at the same time that Livingston County Sheriff's Office is railroading Burt Perry back into prison, the treasurer wakes up and says, we need his cooperation here. And basically, we took a deed in March 1936 for a tax deed, but it says we have an offer from the state of New York for this property, provided we can secure a quitclaim deed from Mr. Perry. And then it says, will you please advise how we can talk to him? And there isn't much evidence of any real conversation, but you can pretty well imagine how that conversation must have gone. This is the upper farm. This is the Ossian State Forest, which is next to the Rattlesnake Hill Wildlife Management Area. This is the Canasarega State Forest, which is across the road. And this property is the only property separating those two pieces of state land.
Who owns that now?
I don't really want to expose the poor guy.
Is he in this room?
If he is, I don't know. I've never met him. He has not answered my letters, let's put it that way. And I don't think it'd be fair to send a busload of tourists to his front door here. But yeah, that property is still there. It's still in private hands. And that property, if Burt Perry ever gave the state a quitclaim deed, it's news to me. So I think Burt, in a way, had the last laugh here. Burt Perry was paroled in July 1945. He was an old man by this time, prematurely old.
68.
Yeah. and went to live with his sister and Eva in Rushville. Now Rushville is right on the border between Ontario County and Yates County. It's on the other side of what is it, Canandaigua Lake, I think.
Yep.
And it's a nice little place. Reminded me a little bit of Dalton, very quiet. I went to the cemetery there, and I went to the village office in order to find the cemetery map. And he died in December, and Eva bought him a plot there, but it wasn't in the family plot. It was a separate plot. She apparently was nearly broke at the time, so it must have been hard to find the money. And like I said, Burt Perry was the guy who didn't want to be found. I found the plot, but there's no evidence of a grave there. So that's pretty much our story. I hope this hasn't gone too long, but it's been an interesting journey for me, and it's not over yet.
Let's have a great
We hope you have enjoyed this presentation by William D. Burt. You will find Bill's 2023 talk, The Erie Railroad, Rosses to the River, on the Nunde Historical Society's YouTube channel called Nunde History. Thank you for watching.